Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMind Factory. Welcome to this next video from the series called Implementing Secure Applications with Microsoft Azure. In this video, we are going to talk about API to API communication or machine-to-machine authorization, and we will discover how to secure communication between two APIs or two services without the user context. So let's start. Let's start with the solution architecture I always present before moving forward. So this is the solution architecture diagram I presented in the first video from this series. So if you didn't see it, please watch the first video from this series. However, in this specific video, we are going to focus on those three elements here actually. So Microsoft Entra External ID, which is identity provider, Document API, which is an API developed with ASP.NET Core, and also Microsoft Graph API. So we will see how to communicate with Microsoft Entra External ID through Microsoft Graph API. And to be more precise, we are going to talk about secure communication between two APIs without the user context. So in this specific case, we will see how to secure communication between Document API and Microsoft Graph API. And to make it more simple to understand how it works and what is the context, I decided to present this scenario, to use this sample scenario in this video. So in our system, in our application solution, there are administrators. And administrators are part of the Secure Cloud App Administrators security group in Microsoft Entra External ID tenant. So we have our identity provider, which is Microsoft Entra External ID. There is security group for administrators, and specific people can be administrators, so can be added as members to this security group. And now when we look at this communication, so administrator in our app would like to call Document API and access any document of any user. Okay, just a simple scenario. So administrator has this privilege to access all the documents, all the files for all users, potentially to fix some issues. This is just an example here. But the case is that, as you remember, for the regular user can only access own files, own invoices, and documents stored in the SQL database. However, if administrator is accessing the application, so administrator authenticated in the Blazor app, and administrator or user is a member of the administrator security group, this user will be able to retrieve all the documents for all the users. So administrator should have access to the full system and any user's document. Just an example, obviously, in the real world example, you can imagine all other things like administrator can access specific sections in the application, administrators can manage other users' accounts, can fix issues with files, and so on and so forth. And now the case is that when administrator is signing in and then this API call is made to Document API, Document API must check if user is really an admin. And to do it, it calls Microsoft Graph API. And obviously, important fact is that we cannot use the same access token that was issued to Blazor application to access Microsoft Graph API. I mean, like Document API to successfully call Microsoft Graph API has to also authenticate. So Document API should use dedicated access token that is to be used with Microsoft Graph API, and that's what we will see in this example. So here is the scenario here. So for Document API, to obtain this access token, obviously Document API will have to call Microsoft Entra ID. But important fact is that Document API obtains access token in context of an application, not a specific user. So in this specific scenario, we use client credentials of grant type with client ID and client secret. So we don't call, like Entra or Microsoft Graph in context of specific user. We call Microsoft Graph API in context of application. So in this case, document API. So once document API retrieves an access token from the identity provider, which is Entra External ID, it can call Microsoft Graph API with this token. And then Microsoft Graph API will validate an access token and will check if user is a member of administrator's security group. So now it's time to see this scenario in action. So here is Microsoft Entra Admin Center, and again, our Secure Cloud Documents API registered. So this is the same app registration that we saw in the previous video. And as we can see under API permissions, I can define different kinds of permissions for this API. An important fact is, please note that here, under API permissions, I have two application permissions. So delegated permissions are for the users. So actually, you can call this API on behalf of authenticated user. But actually, our scenario is different in this context. We don't have user context here. We want to authenticate application itself so it can call Microsoft Graph API to check whether user is a member of administrator's security group. So obviously, we will have to pass the object ID, unique identifier of this user in the request to Microsoft Graph API, but we need an access token to access this Microsoft Graph API. So that's why, as you can see, I have those two permissions added here, user.read.all. So it enables me to read all the users and their profiles. And also I have this group.read.all, and this will allow this documents API to also retrieve information about the user membership in security groups. And we need this because we actually want to check whether user is a member of administrator's security group. So how I added those permissions, I click add a permission and then Microsoft Graph API. And as you can see, you can select delegated permissions. So your application needs to access an API as the sign-in user, but we don't have context here. So we select application permissions. So your application runs as a background service or daemon without a sign-in user. And actually, this is just a simple example because obviously you could use delegated permissions here, but I want to present this scenario where you can utilize an access token for application itself so it can communicate with Microsoft Graph API. So I selected application permissions, and from there I found all those permissions I presented here. So user.read.all, user.read.all. So group read.all and user read.all. So perfect. Once we have those permissions, obviously we have to grant admin consent. And now we can integrate our application with Microsoft Graph API. So we can obtain the access token and then call Microsoft Graph API to retrieve the information about the membership. So let's switch to Visual Studio to explain some code there. So here is the Secure Cloud Document API project in the Visual Studio. Let me expand it. And again, under dependency injection, I have MS Graph Service collection extensions. And under this static class, I have some extension methods. So first of all, obviously, we have to add configuration for Microsoft Graph API. So without this, we will not be able to securely communicate with Microsoft Graph API. So we need an endpoint information for the Microsoft Graph API to successfully communicate with it. So first of all, we have to load Microsoft Graph configuration. Let me open this. So we need the tenant ID, so the ID of our Entra External ID tenant, application ID, application secret, and also the ID of administrator's security group. That's also important. And obviously application ID and application secret, those are the credentials for my web API that I register in Microsoft Entra External ID. So I have my client ID, and also I can obtain client secret in the Entra Admin Center. So now, once I have this configuration loaded, as we can see here, I'm using a client secret credential, here, and I'm providing information about the tenant ID, application ID, so client ID of my document API, and app secret. So the app secret I generated in Entra Admin Center. And I return Graph Service Client here using those credentials I provided. And now you can ask, okay, how it's possible? So let me show you Manage NuGet Packages tab here. So under Install, as you can see, I have this Microsoft Graph NuGet package used. So it provides you with all the methods that you will need to obtain information from Microsoft Graph API. So we can easily integrate with Microsoft Graph API with this package. Perfect. So now, once I have Graph Service Client registered, I have my Graph User Service class here. And as you can see, I'm using Graph Service Client instance here. And below, I have this method here, okay? So I have get user security group membership async. So I have to pass information about the user ID here. And I have this user ID because of the fact that Documents API is secure with access token. So I can grab information about the user ID from an access token that is sent in the authorization header to this Document API from Blazor application. Now moving forward, as you can see here, I'm retrieving information about the membership for this user. So I'm using Graph Service Client, that users, I'm providing user ID here, member of, graph group, get async, and here actually I'm getting information about the membership. And now once I retrieve this membership information, I can check actually if the user is in a specific security group. Okay, so in this case, let me find all the references here. So as you can see, I'm retrieving information about the security groups for the user, and then I'm checking if any of those security groups have the ID that I provided in the configuration for the administrator's security group. So here I'm checking the ID of this group, and I'm checking whether user is a member of this group. If user is a member of this group, it means that user can load all the invoices because it means that user is an administrator. But if not, we will return an authorized response and we will display information that you are not authorized to get information about the invoices for all the users. So that's how actually it's implemented. So as we can see here, I'm using client credentials flow and application permissions to access Microsoft Graph API to get information about the membership for specific users. So in this specific scenario, we saw how to implement this communication without the user context actually. So we are not using the same access token that is sent to a Documents API. We have to obtain an access token for Document API itself, and then this Document API will be able to communicate with Microsoft Graph API. Great, so that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting and helpful. In the next video, we are going to talk about Azure RBAC and manage identities, so I also hope that you will enjoy the next video. Thank you so much for watching.